Hey, welcome to another episode of the Reboot Recovery Show with Evan Owens, and you are not going to want to miss today's episode. We have an incredible guest on today, my friend Dan Sartor. He's a clinical psychologist. He and I are going to go deep when it comes to the subject of trauma. So here we go. Well, Dan, thank you so much for joining us. I don't know, should I call you Dr. Dan or just Dan? What do you go by these days? Sir Dan? Are you um, like a
If you
knight?
call me anything but Dan, I'll feel embarrassed and I'll blush and be uncomfortable. So please call me Dan.
Okay. In that
Thanks.
case, I'm definitely going to. And you live down in the Atlanta area.
That's right.
And so every day you get to deal with the trauma of traffic, which is a wonderful thing. Those of us who live in big cities like Nashville and Atlanta know that. Some of you listening live in rural communities, don't really know the joy of traffic yet. So, but Dan, you and I met not that long ago, actually. And for those of us, maybe who are new to the Reboot Recovery Show, obviously we talk here about one thing: overcoming trauma and embracing a brighter future. But over the years, it's been interesting. We talk about this idea of peer-to-peer healing a lot within the reboot communities. But I can go back not that long ago, even 5, 6 years ago, where the idea of peer-to-peer based solutions was seen almost discarded, almost like, that's kind of like that weird AA stuff. Sure, support groups are good, but really what's needed is this clinical intervention. And then on top of that, with the reboot model, we say not only are we peer-to-peer, but we're also faith-based. And that also kind of got discarded a little bit. Like, but let's leave the faith people to the faith issues and the mental health people to the mental health issues. And I think one of the things that instantly connected was obviously you have lots of different degrees, you have lots of different schooling, you're a practicing clinical psychologist, you oversee a team of other people, but yet the faith aspect of psychology, the faith aspect of trauma healing is something that you and I connected on as well, and that's not super common. And so I
Right.
want to talk about what are some of the things that the clinical community is evolving in its understanding of this spirituality as it's impacted by trauma. What are some of the new articles and things that you're kind of turned on to? What are some of those things that you're seeing change?
Mhm. Yeah, well, maybe I'll give a little background context. And Evan, one of
Yeah.
my favorite things about our last conversation together centered on this very topic. And I felt some wonderful energy in each of us and between us as we talked about this. And I think that's not just because of our personal interests, but because of its relevance overall with the
Right.
folks that we deal with. And let's just name it as it is. Many of the people that we interact with and deal with, they're just like you and me.
Mm.
We're no different. So that there's something here that goes deep, I think, into the human spirit. And the background context on this is that for a long time, psychology and psychiatry had a very strong aversion to religiosity and to faith, and in particular Christianity. They saw a lot of abuses of power. There were things they didn't understand. Psychology was really trying to prove itself as a legitimate science. And in order to do that, in the way that things were sort of set up culturally, there was this very false but widely accepted notion that faith and science, Christianity and science were antithetical to one another. And so there were a lot of cultural and philosophical dynamics that set the stage for all of this as over time psychology began to become more and more aware of trauma. And of course, that happened in large capacity with the events of world wars and what we were seeing with
Mm.
soldiers as they would come back, and shell shock and these other things that we would see. But one of the things that we could never quite get away from was the fact that part of the the equation for resilience in the face of
Hmm.
trauma and an important part of post-traumatic growth is our systems of meaning. Like that's science's
Hmm.
way to try and kind of cleanse
Right.
the aspect of it. But if you go any deeper than that language, you recognize that our systems of meaning are these things that every one of us holds in our worldview, the things that we believe to be true of the world and of ourselves and of
Yeah.
others. And if there's more to the world than just the material aspects. And these are things that you can't prove in a court of law and things you can't prove with a scientific method. These are things that we hold really deeply. And so we saw from the research itself that these systems of meaning and the things that we believed were so crucial to our resilience and to our post-traumatic growth, that it was undeniable from a scientific perspective, even if you were somebody who believed in this war and antithesis between science and faith, or science and
Right.
Christianity in particular. And so I think that forced um, a need for some kind of reconciliation or rapprochement, or at least an openness to forms of spirituality and systems of belief that go beyond what we can prove in the material world, that really do affect who
Mm.
we are and how we operate and how healthy we can be. And
Yeah.
so I think that's sparked a lot of a greater
Yeah.
openness or dialogue now.
Yeah, and you're right, because even if you go back and read some of the earliest psychological writings, a lot of it viewed religiosity or people of faith as clinically ill, right? That there was this sense that they were believing in invisible things. And on the flip side, you saw this in the faith community for many years, a rejection of science, right? That there was
Mhm.
uh, no place for medications, no place for any type of clinical intervention. And I believe those two things are coming together. And with your background, of course, it's interesting. Of course, you have the clinical degrees, but you also have an undergrad in from Moody, right? From a Christian university. And so you
That's right.
kind of bring that to the table, which I think is really refreshing. And we talk about this idea of systems of meaning. And one of the things that we try to talk a lot about is, finding purpose in your pain. This idea that God never wastes wounds, that He's able to recycle the pain in our lives to do something with it. But I've also been challenged by people. I know some of the people who listen to this podcast maybe are course leaders or course participants. Maybe they've heard the phrase, and I believe it was a Russian, I can't remember if it was Karl Marx or who it was off the top of my head right now for some reason, but um, it was that religion was the opioid of the masses, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And there was this idea that weak people needed religion to justify meaning out of terrible things, when in reality, terrible things were just terrible things, and that's
Yes.
all that they were. And I
Yes.
think that's one of the things that we encounter is trauma wounds our our trust, not just in each other, but it wounds our trust that there's this loving being, this loving divine creator. What are some of the things, what are some of the questions, what are some of the guided kind of principles you use to help start restoring that trust, this idea that it's not just a crutch for the weak, but there is truly a loving God who wants to redeem that which seems irredeemable? What are some of the processes you go through with patients to kind of get them there?
Yeah. Well, I think it starts with an understanding of this, that there are all sorts of ways that we can avoid our pain and avoid the very real and awful impacts of trauma. And like an easy go-to is to say, well, we can turn to alcohol and
Right.
drink ourselves numb, right? Um, it may be hard to imagine, but I think it's also true that we can use certain practices and systems of belief to deny and avoid going through the pain that's necessary
There you go. Good.
to number one, be real, and number two, to actually truly heal.
Right.
And so when I think of those criticisms that have been offered in the past, but at times presently today, I think the kernel of truth in them is that I can use my Christian faith to deny and suppress and avoid
Good.
a pain. And I don't believe that that's true biblical,
Mm-mm.
historical Christianity.
Right.
Um, and I think we only need to open up the pages of the scriptures with our eyes partly open to see that the Psalms are full of lament.
Yeah.
And while they declare a trust that God is on his throne and is ultimately good, there's also no shortage of people in the community of faith, and this gets to the peer thing a little bit too here,
Mm.
um, being honest about their pain and
Right.
being honest about their doubt and
Right.
being honest about wondering, God, where are you? Because it appears that the wicked prosper and the waves crash over me and the darkness is overwhelming.
Right.
and death and loneliness and abandonment is my only companion, right? The psalmist writes.
That's right.
And I think a good theology allows us to see something like the story of Job as a real gift to us, as if God is
Hmm.
saying, I understand that the realities of this broken, sinful world and the
Right.
pain that you experience as my creature um, is such that you'll lose sight of me and you'll be overwhelmed. And
Right.
I haven't abandoned you. Continue to cry out to me. Don't take the philosophy of Job's friends
Right.
that this is happening just because you did something wrong. And if you would own that and start to behave rightly, it would all be okay. There's something much larger and grander at play in all of this from a historically orthodox Christian worldview. And in that, we find that as we cry out and we don't feel him to be near, at some point in time, when we hang in there, um, he does show up. And we
Yeah.
realize that what we thought and what we said, like Job, we cover our mouth and we
Right.
stand in awe. And then the final chapter of Job just records these tremendous transformations in him of generosity
Right.
because of the suffering he's endured.
Right.
And so
That
some of that
there's
is
this
just,
level, right? There's this level of faith. But I want to go back real quick before we move on to the trust building. I want to go back to something you mentioned, that there's this idea that sometimes our faith can actually be a tool that we use to numb or to avoid. And I think this is something that when I go around and meet with various types of denominations and different church structures, it's fascinating because there's this positive brand of Christianity, right? And this positive brand is we don't speak of that. We don't give it power by speaking of it. We won't even say that. We're gonna speak life. We're gonna only say positive things. We're gonna only have positive emotions, and we're gonna name it, and things are gonna be good, and all this. And I have found that a lot of times those are the churches with the deepest mental and emotional wounds,
mhm.
because it's so contrary to our psyche to keep saying like this terrible thing that's happening to me. Oh, it's not bad. God's turning it for good. It's not bad. The fact that I'm being abused, it's not bad. It's like no, it is bad. It's bad enough that should be catalyzing a repentance or a condemnation of the action by the other person who's doing that to you or experiencing that. And I find that sometimes it almost fosters this environment of approval or of allowance, that we allow it both in our own lives but also in the lives of others. And I think what you just said is a warning to all of us as Christians, is to experience redemption. And I'm processing this in real time. I'm trying to understand what you're saying, make sure I'm understanding. But like, it's almost like to truly say, okay, this terrible thing has some redeemed element to it. I first have to acknowledge that this was a terrible thing, and that it was an intersection with the brokenness. And
Yeah.
I can't just smile it away or pray it away. And I think that's a good warning to us of
Mm.
a kind of a shallow theology, isn't it?
Yes, I really think so. And I think we need a robust theology of suffering
Mm,
so that we can call evil for what it is
yeah,
by recognizing its impact on others and ourselves,
good.
and then enter into a way of relating with one another where there's an honesty about it that I want to say is not just a wallowing in it, right? I think sometimes the fair criticism of those who stay on the positive side is they don't want to get caught in a wallowing. And I get and I understand that. There's a
Mm,
place in the middle, a golden mean here, where we don't go to either extreme and hold on as best as we can in community to both.
mm,
What's good and beautiful, and the promises that through our suffering, God does a redemptive work. That by following Jesus and taking up our cross to follow Him, that we will die and there will be a resurrection.
right,
And we have that promise because that's what's been done in the life of our Savior first.
right.
And the fact of the matter is there's something really beautiful and glorious in the resiliency, in the endurance, in beauty overcoming the suffering, but there is still very real suffering. And
Right.
it's in the vulnerability and the exchange of that that some of our deepest points of intimacy and connection are forged.
Mm,
And it's the relationship and the love that does the healing more than anything else. One of the beautiful things about Reboot is that it embodies that and
yeah.
provides a channel for that so beautifully. And it allows people to share together in the stories and the narratives of the experience of evil for the purposes of overcoming it in ways that don't leave individuals isolated and
Right.
feeling like they must be crazy because they're the only ones.
So on that, this is probably a pretty tough question, but here's something that I've been worried about is the wrong word, but troubled by might be a better example. I mean, okay, so we look at the tremendous growth of the mental health industry. Let's call it that for sake of a better, the business of mental health. I mean, if you think about it, it's not just independent counselors and nonprofits. There's giant conglomerate, venture capitally funded mental health organizations,
Yes.
right? That all are
Yes.
promising to do some form of better help, right? I mean, they're all for, not the brand Better Help. Sorry, that was not a slam on them. The point is there's this big brand that was an accidental misstep there. I assure you, this is in no way doing that. But
Yeah.
I think that they all want to promise this, and yet I look at the data, and the data doesn't actually point to a very encouraging picture. You would think that as an industry has grown from X to X to over 160, 180 billion dollars, I think now per year just in counseling services, you would think that we would be experiencing this awakening of mental health in a good way, that we'd be experiencing more wellness. But yet it almost seems like the greater the awareness about mental health illness, let's call it mental illness instead of mental health,
Yes.
the greater the comorbidities of various illnesses have become. And so I guess you having seen it for a lot longer than I have, what do you attribute it to? Are we just getting less healthy that quickly? Is there a corollary between the growth of awareness in an industry and the growth of some type of unhealth that's happening? And this is why I think Reboot is the way it is we don't claim to have all the answers, but I do believe that authentic community has been lost in society, that we're not real with one another anymore like we used to be. But I don't have your seat. I don't sit among people who read and write and teach and learn at an academic level as well as a clinician level. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it is a tough question and a good one. I have to give a caveat here and say, um, what I will say as my answer is just an opinion, and I'm
Yeah.
armchair quarterbacking for
Yeah.
this a
He's
little
like, I
bit.
speak I don't speak on behalf of any organization that I claim to represent.
That's right. And at the same time, I'm really glad for the question because I think it's important. If in fact the emperor is naked, right,
Mm,
we need to be able to talk about it.
right.
And here's what I believe about it, and here's what I perceive in it.
This show does not endorse nudity. Okay, Dan, I know, but we're not. That's not what we're about here. So, but
Especially
anyway,
part of our
of our
politically.
clinical, if
Yeah,
clinicians, if you walk in and your clinician is nude,
that's
leave
her on the right.
immediately. You're in
Yeah,
the wrong office.
to be sure. Um, so I think there is an interesting question about, of course, incidence is going to appear to increase if we have increased awareness and we know what we're looking for.
Right.
But I'm not so sure that that explains the entire trend. And I
Mm-hmm.
do wonder if there are aspects of our culture and where we're at today globally, the kind of risk and the angst that we live with, and the kind of knowledge, and we're constantly inundated digitally with messages, with
Mm-hmm.
images, with so much um, that I guess I have to say I'm not surprised with as much as we're taking in that
Mm-hmm.
that's affecting our mental health. And a lot of that is negative because we have to be very proactive to monitor and regulate what we take in that's positive.
Right.
We're just inundated every day. But above and beyond that, coming to the question regarding psychology and mental health services and what those things can offer, um, I do believe that a couple of things, that our understanding of mental health and mental illness is still really quite young. And there's a lot for us to learn, and there's a lot that we don't know. I
Mm-hmm.
do believe what we do know and the things that we're able to do are good and helpful. But
Mm,
I think at times we're over optimistic. We want them to deliver more than they can. And at the
mm,
same time, it's one of a few options out there. So that makes it ripe, I might say,
right.
in in a capitalistic kind of economy and system. And I'm not anti-capitalism. I'm just saying
No, I hear what you're saying. Yeah.
things there's that there is, just by nature of all of that, opportunism
Right.
that begins to take hold. And
Right.
so um, I still believe that there's something valuable in the science
Yeah.
and the interventions and the application that comes from the science.
Yeah.
But I do want to be realistic, and actually, a tool becomes more powerful when we recognize what it can and can't do. When I
Right.
stop using a screwdriver to try and drive a nail, that screwdriver is much more useful to
Right.
me and
Right.
less likely to cause some kind of harm or damage.
Right. Right.
And so I think some of this is learning some of its limits and 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 cherishing the complexity of
Mm-hmm.
humanity and how we're wired and how we're created, and recognizing that it cannot be everything, though it might have some essential pieces for us.
Mm-hmm. No, I
And so
think
that's how I see that. And I think we're
I love
discussing.
that answer. Yeah, I love the answer, and I love the acknowledgement of the youth of it. I think somehow I was just talking to a board member at Reboot about. I said, we have evidence to show that Reboot's helping people. I'm a little bit of a believer that you can have evidence and research to show that pretty much anything helps people if you study it the right way. Research is very suspect that way, depending on how it's executed. But it's I said to them, I said we have to be careful with being overconfident. And I brought up something that was actually, I said, if you go back and look at some of the psychiatric practices of, say, like the 1940s and 50s, and we look at them now, we think those people are crazy. Like, what were they possibly thinking? This is a terrible idea. But in their time, they were 100% confident that they were the experts, right? That they had the latest, greatest research. They were the bleeding edge of what was going to change the face of our mental wellness. And I think that that's one of the risks that we run into in the nonprofit and the clinical space is a short-term impact with a high degree of overconfidence that we've cracked the code, right?
Hmm.
That we have the answer. And every now and then I'll be around another nonprofit. Something that makes me cringe is when I'm around another nonprofit that says, all these other programs don't work, but our program works. It always makes me like, "Ugh," like, just because your program works for a tiny subset of people over a very short period of time with tools and measurements that you selected knowing that you would likely do well in those tools and measurements, right?
Mm.
and
Yes.
and so I think that that's something that I liked hearing you say is there's this element of, I think, being honest with patients. If some of us listening, maybe we're starting with a clinician for the first time, maybe we're going to a counselor, I think sometimes maybe that honesty that what we're trying here is very complicated and it's not going to be a linear straight line, and some things we try might work and some things we try might not work, as opposed to maybe what people hope when they sit down in that chair across from you is that you're going to have the answers and it's going to be 8 sessions and I'm better. And that's not necessarily true. And I think that we meet so many people who have become discouraged. They've met with counselors and they don't feel like they are better yet. And I think that maybe we could do a better job in all of our worlds, nonprofits and for-profits alike, of kind of setting expectations about the complexity of what
Hmm.
we're encountering. And so if that's you listening right now and you're maybe leading a reboot course or you're attending, that reboot leader might only have led this course a couple of times. Like, they don't have all the answers. Neither do Jenny and I. Neither do you. And I think that that's something. There's freedom in embracing that complexity.
Yeah.
I think that's really beautiful.
And I think there's something to be said for acknowledging that there are some wounds that we experience that we'll carry scars and marks of and will be impacted
Forever.
by the
That's
rest
right.
of our lives. And the aim for me is not the undoing of that. Now, I
Mm,
want as much healing and alleviation of suffering as is possible. And I think that's consistent with God's good character and his goodwill. But what I'd like to say is that there are some things that some scars that I carry are also, I mean this in the best sense of the word, Evan. I think you know what I mean when I say this. They're also my trophies.
Hmm.
They're not for self glory, but they testify to something.
What you've overcome.
And yes, and the grace of God and His presence when I
Right.
come to the place to see that as being true. And that there's something about that that is even more glorious than if
Yeah.
I had never faced the adversity to begin with.
Hmm.
Um, and
Yes.
I think about this, I think about Reboot and some of its history with those who have served our nation, and they walk away not only with physical injuries, but the psychological injuries from the traumas
Hmm.
that they've seen and experienced, and in some cases, certainly participated in. And what I'd like to say is that their sacrifice is worthy of
Hmm.
something that's not an easy fix.
Right.
And I think if we can just
That's
settle
good.
into that, what I'm not saying here is that
No,
these
that's
things
really good.
heal. What we need is to not be alone in the woundedness and in the
Hmm.
grief and in the healing process. And what we need is just enough progress as we journey that there's hope, that
Yeah.
there's that we see something of value in the efforts that we're putting forward to live well and live valiantly each day. But what kind of life would it be? And I think our brothers and sisters who have served sacrificially will resonate with this. What kind of life would this be if there wasn't something worth dying for, or
Right.
something worth sacrificing something of our lives for?
Yeah.
What I don't want to do is not regard that in myself, and in particular, those who do that sacrificially, or those who had to endure it and didn't have a choice, right? That's
Right.
other forms of trauma that someone's what we would describe as a victim before they become a survivor.
Right.
And there's something, I would argue, really spiritual and something beautifully connecting and redemptive, and being able to see those things and name them and enter into a conversation and celebration of them, so to speak,
Yeah.
um, in the journey and the fighting. Nothing in life that's worth doing comes easily.
Right. Yeah. There's
And
a.
so I think this just reflects that, the very thing
Yeah.
that we're talking about here.
I love that. Yeah. My mom had a quote that she had. I don't know where she had it. Maybe it was something she wrote. She used to write a lot, or my dad does too. But one of the things that said something about, I'm going to butcher it. So if they listen to this, I apologize in advance. But it said something like, a person who doesn't love much doesn't fight much.
Mm.
And it was this idea that when we love deeply, we'll fight for that thing that we love. And it didn't mean war necessarily. I mean, it meant, and it didn't mean fight like fisticuffs. By the
Yes.
way, I just used the word fisticuffs. Like, who's used that word since there you go. That's you're welcome, listeners. There you go.
Well, yeah, at least
Fisticuffs.
we need to bring it back.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. We'll edit that one out. But I do think that I also, as you were talking, I got this really interesting kind of mental picture of that scene in the Tom Hanks movie Apollo 13, where
Mm.
they have the problem and the NASA guys come in and they dump all the pieces on the table and they say, "Here's the materials. We got to figure out how to create something out of these materials." And I think that each of us is such a complicated divine creature, that we have such a complex wiring that trauma impacts us all slightly differently. And so the solution is going to be a little bit like dumping out all the parts of the wound on a table and saying, okay, let's figure out how to make this whole again. Let's figure out how to make this work in a different way. Not even whole again, actually in a revised version of ourselves.
Yeah.
And how that's a complicated process. You think about in that movie how long it took them, how many times they got it wrong before they finally found the pieces that fit together that worked for them. And I think that's how a lot of people who go through the trauma healing journey feel. This is something I talked about in a previous podcast, was that a lot of people feel like they're failing at healing, and I challenge them to reframe that as, I'm finding healing, that I'm on this journey to constantly find what's going to work for my unique type of wound. And okay, so tell us a little bit about the organization you work for, Eagle Ranch, is that correct?
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
tell
right.
us a little bit about that organization and sort of what the mission is. And if people, we have a lot of listeners who are all over the country, many of whom are down in your neck of the woods. So tell us
Yeah.
a little bit about that program.
Yeah, Eagle Ranch is a beautiful organization. I'm so honored to be a part of it. It is a faith-based nonprofit that serves troubled youth troubled youth and their families. And its mission is to make life better for children and their families and to positively impact our community for the cause of Christ. And so at Eagle Ranch, we take young folks, usually they're about middle school age, who are beginning to show some real challenges and difficulties in their social life, in their academic functioning, at home with family, and so forth, and their own mental health. And we have a residential program that lasts about 2 years, and they come and they live here in homes. Their families are involved in a therapeutic program and process as well. And the way we describe it is it's a family renewal program. Those kids go home on weekends and during holidays, and then the aim is at the end of their time here that the family has gone through its process of renewal and healing, as well as the child, so that that child is moved back in permanently in their homes
Wonderful.
with a whole changed family. It's a good and beautiful thing. And my role here is with a new initiative that's called the Wings Center, and it is an outpatient counseling center that's offering outpatient mental health services to the community that's separate from the
Right.
counselors and therapeutic staff that works with the youth and their families. And we are a standard, so to speak, outpatient counseling center where we are wanting to just serve this particular community. We're on the very northeastern edge of Metro Atlanta, so
Hmm.
in downtown and in the more busy parts of the city, there are more services available, fewer out here.
Hmm.
And so, kind of going back to your comments as we started today, I wrestle with traffic less now than I used to. Now that I've
Okay.
taken this job and moved out here to Flowery Branch where we're at, but we're
What a nice sounding city, Flowery
yeah,
Branch.
yeah,
Wow.
yeah. It's
I want to
it's
live in. I want to live in. I don't know. That sounds like buttery bread. I live in buttery bread next door to Flowery Branch.
yeah,
It's
it's pretty lovely, and I'm glad to be in this community. But we're hiring staff so that we can, from our own Christian mission and the foundation of our faith, serve anybody who comes through this door with the best mental health services that we can offer them based on our resources. And so it's an exciting thing to be part of something new and a startup
yeah.
in that regard. Yeah.
Well, and your background having an MBA as well as your clinical degree, obviously that this is a neat opportunity for you to deploy your business acumen and your clinical acumen, which is not always the case. For the clinical folks out there, it's not, it's a rare thing that you meet super kind of business minded clinicians. So that's really neat. And some of the folks listening, I know, have teenagers who are going through very difficult situations, and can they just go to Google and Eagle Ranch and go there and at least submit to be considered? Is that the type of situation? Is it a first come first serve? Do they have to meet some requirements? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so they can go to eagleranch.org, and
Okay.
that will take them to our website. And there's some information that they can find out about us. There's a phone number there, and they can contact someone who basically is responsible for receiving intake phone calls. And there is a bit of a
Okay.
process there. There's a process of matching. There are some kids and families that are facing issues that are outside of the scope of what we're able to serve well.
Of course.
And another thing is that they have to be within, I think it's like a 90-mile radius, because again, the program is for youth and their families.
Right.
But we have some programming down the road that we're looking toward that will expand that, and that will be able to serve youth that don't have the benefit of being parts of families and having caregivers that would on board with a program like that. So we're seeing a need there, so we're going to be expanding our programming for that. So just because someone's distant, or they know of a child who doesn't have the kind of family support,
Hmm.
that's okay. And a lot of families do pay for a portion of the services here, but Eagle Ranch has done a great job of developing a strong reputation among people who care about families that are willing to support and donate.
Financially,
So
yeah.
we try and make the services here as affordable and accessible as possible. I think it's pretty rare that folks get turned away based on those issues of need. And we just want to be wise stewards, but also keep the mission first. And so that's really
Well, I love the idea of the new outpatient counseling center. We love Eagle Ranch. Think the world of it. And so, like I said, I'm excited to have you on. I think it's neat to hear it from a different perspective than what a lot of our guests kind of come from, that peer, or they themselves have personally experienced trauma and they share of their own story. So I think it's really neat to have you on to share a little different perspective. Some highlights from this that I'm taking away is, kind of a deep theology about suffering is critical, that we don't want to use our faith to become its own numbing, its own blocker to healing. I love that idea. I really like the idea that when we go through trauma, that there's a complex wound that's occurred, and so therefore sometimes it's a complex healing that has to occur. Those are just some of my nuggets, and you listening, hopefully you have some nuggets of your own. Thank you so much for joining us. We are out of time for this episode of the Reboot Recovery Show, but I hope you'll join us for future episodes. We're going to keep adding more, and maybe we'll be able to have you back on in the future. I hope so. Check him out. I don't know, is it on social media, Dan Sartor? What do? They find you on People Magazine? Where do they go?
Well, they can find me through the Eagle Ranch website. They can find me also through, we have a new Wing Center website, which is thewingcenter.org. But also, I have a private website, or a separate one, I should say, dansartorphd.com. And that's where actually I do some other work that's related to working with nonprofits in program evaluation and consulting, and especially in the area of vicarious traumatization, compassion fatigue, and burnout, helping organizations and their staff to be able to sustain in the work, because doing the work opens up our own past traumas, but also it splashes up on us. And so part of my heart's desire is to help organizations and individuals to be able to do this work long-term well, because there's such a need for it. So they can find out more about that at dansartorphd.com.
So go check that out. Make sure to follow him on all those places. Check out those websites. And again, Dan, thank you so much. Again, this is your host, Evan Owens. As always, like we say at the end of every episode, keep moving forward as we overcome trauma together. God bless.